In our algorithm-fueled digital age, personal pains become a premium product. But what happens when we prioritise visibility over actual healing? Today, I'm joined by a guest who's challenging the way we talk about trauma, class, and the stories we tell ourselves. I'm Scott Cassidy. This is the Creative Resistance Podcast, and today's guest is Darren McGarvey. Darren is an Orwell Prize winning author, a vital cultural commentator, and the hip-hop artist known as Loki. From the raw analysis and cultural evisceration of class-based systems in Poverty Safari to his latest work, Trauma Industrial Complex, Darren has consistently pushed back against easy narratives, forcing a deeper conversation on the proximity gap in British media and the necessity of personal agency when making change. We caught up on a bright day, me just outside Edinburgh, Darren in East Kilbride, to talk about his creative roots in hip-hop, the discipline of the flow state, but we also dive deep into the themes of his current UK tour, Trauma Industrial Complex. Darren pulls back the curtain on the risks of public storytelling in a digital age, challenging the idea that simply surviving a thing isn't the same as recovering from it. It's a candid look at the tension between being a working class voice, navigating the media industries that often want to commodify that experience. I loved sitting down with Darren, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Darren McGarvey, very warm welcome to Creative Resistance Podcast, mate. How are you?
I'm very well, Scott. How's yourself?
Yeah, I'm good, man. I'm good. Just trucking on, just about surviving, which is sound. So just to give the listeners a bit of context, I'm recording this just outside Edinburgh in Midlothian, a tiny wee village called Falladam. Whereabouts are you?
I'm in East Kilbride, just outside Glasgow, and it's a very nice, clear, bright, brisk day.
Yeah, same through here, mate, which is great. This is a relatively new thing, this whole podcast, but when I first started it, I had a list of people that I thought would be brilliant to be on, and you were right at the top of that list, so I really appreciate you coming on to chat. I know you're in the middle of a tour, I know you're really busy, so thank you very much for giving us the time. It is appreciated.
Pleasure. I see you had Victoria McNulty on.
Yeah, amazing. Do you know Victoria?
I do. So it's an honour to be in good company like Victoria. Yeah, she's amazing.
She was awesome. Yeah, really good. So yeah, nice one. Listen, let's get stuck in. So this is obviously Creative Resistance. I speak to people about creativity. I speak to people who are tackling the big things that matter, but I always like to start by asking guests to go right back to the start and look at their own creative roots. I think I first knew of you as Loki when you were rapping. I know you still do. You've since then gone on to transition to best-selling author, broadcaster. You're on the telly. I've seen you on political programs, and you do all kinds of stuff. But I'm really interested. What came before that? How did your creativity start? And the reason I'm asking that is there's been something that's occurred on this podcast and another one where males especially have disclosed that they found it quite difficult to be openly creative when they were kids because it wasn't the done thing. So yeah, how did it start for you? What got you scribbling lyrics and starting to rap in the first place?
Well, I grew up in a kind of family where creativity was encouraged. My dad's a musician. My uncle's a musician, and so he also went to art school, my uncle. So there was, art and installations and, plans to do projects. That was sort of part of our kind of family vocabulary. So the struggle that a lot of boys from working class backgrounds face is that they feel creative, but they don't see anyone around them who's creative, so they sort of shut that part of themselves down. That wasn't my experience. My experience was that was all normal to me. What happened was, though, once I started to mix more in the community outside the family, I started to realise that my interests were perceived as kind of odd. And so that's where the struggle came, I think, in a social sense. But for me, the creativity, I was into everything. I was into acting, I was into writing, I was into drawing. I used to use my granny's little tape recorder. It was a kind of mix between a tape player and a FM AM radio. But you could press record and play and record audio into it. It had a little built-in microphone. So I used to make like little mock radio shows and what you would call podcasts now. Do you know what I mean? I was just into that sort of stuff. But it was really that hip hop was the thing that I gravitated towards in my adolescence, partly because there weren't a lot of opportunities to become a playwright or develop my acting talent. I'd studied drama at school and got a good grade for that. But hip hop was great because it was accessible. There wasn't a big seasonal subscription. You didn't need to own a fancy pair of shoes. You didn't need to rely on a parent to take you there and from and all the things that, you know, theatre kids really need. So hip hop just became the art form that I was in, particularly the rapping. I liked the directness of the expression, and I enjoyed the creative process where you're trying to figure out the riddle of how to put the words together. I found that when I'm in that mode of creativity, I'm very free of anxiety. All my problems are insignificant. You know, that what they call now a flow state. I get that when it comes to, you know, writing lyrics.
Yeah, Simon. See, obviously, when you're rapping, you're talking about lived experience. You're exploring sort of societal issues, which you've then go on and do on the page, on the stage, you know, and on the telly and stuff. Is it the same bit of creativity you're tapping into when you're doing that? Are you using the same skills, do you think?
It all comes from the same reservoir, I think, because regardless of the different challenges or liberties that you can take, depending on the medium that you're using, there's always the same experience when you feel like you're drawing very cleanly from the reservoir. And it happens intermittently. The real discipline and the work side of it is to continue to work even when you're not necessarily getting that clear connection. But whether it's doing a piece to camera for television or doing something on stage, public speaking, writing a rap, whatever form of creativity it is, you can feel when you're connecting with the idea, and when you connect with it, it's because you understand it. So the expression kind of takes care of itself. It comes across clear and concise and engaging. But sometimes you've got to phone it in because the work still needs done. You can't always have the antenna tuned into a divine frequency. But yeah, I think it all comes from the same place ultimately.
Yeah, I think that thing you mentioned there is that graft, sitting down to graft and not waiting for that sort of inspiration to strike. I often see is the difference between people that have made it in the creative fields and people that haven't. Do you know, you're actually putting that work ethic that's in there. Yeah, that was interesting, man. Thank you so much. You mentioned working class and how it can be difficult for some working class boys. And I think on previous chats you mentioned Victoria McNulty. I've had Scottish writer Alan Bissett on recently as well, and they both spoke about, both from working class backgrounds, and both spoke about how it's been difficult at times to move through the kind of air quotes middle class kind of media spheres. And I'm interested, you've spoken a lot about this, and in the social distance between us, you talk about the proximity gap. Those making decisions are so far removed from people they affect, which ties directly into something Victoria said. And she spoke about how there's loads of money out there to gather the stories of working class voices, but 9 times out of 10, they'll parachute someone in from outside to collate and curate those voices so they're getting seen through someone else's eyes rather than actually empowering people who are natural storytellers to sort of tell their own thing as well. I had another author on, Kieran Goddard. I don't know if you know Kieran's work, who's a fantastic author, and he described it as a cleaving, where he felt like he was kind of cut adrift from, where he grew up and where he was now. Alan Bissett described it as being too middle class to go back to where he grew up, but too working class to ever be fully accepted. How do you handle that tension? And have you ever felt patronised by the kind of very poverty industry that you've critiqued in things like Poverty Safari?
Yes, I have. My situation was different though, because I already had earned my stripes really as someone who had taken a certain amount of hits from people of a more middle class background who were perhaps a bit affronted or irritated by what they might see as my precociousness as a sort of young working class person. But the thing that just like leveled the playing field for me was really the Orwell Prize. And once you get that stamp of legitimacy, everybody around you resituates themselves. So you stop getting treated like a working class person, and you start getting treated like one of them. Now, I'm not saying that's not extremely weird, and I take on board what your previous contributors have said regarding that feeling of existing in a kind of space between social classes. part of that, I think, is a genuine cultural challenge, and then I think that's also exacerbated when we ourselves as individuals bring a certain level of need for approval, or a certain need to belong, that can sometimes actually be dealt with by becoming more secure in ourselves and who we are, rather than necessarily trying to reorder the tectonic plates of class around us so that we feel like we fit somewhere. But it's for each individual on their own journey to decide. What I realised was that, there's a certain level of intuition that's involved in how you navigate traditionally middle class professions and industries. And if you've grown up in a working class community but you're interested in the arts, you've already started to develop those skills because you're already having to navigate within your own social context. For me, it was, yes, I'm into art, but here I'm a hardcore rapper and I have a kind of a tough persona that I'm projecting out. And really that was me navigating, because that's not necessarily a true reflection of who I am in my day-to-day life. I'm not as confrontational as the Loki persona might suggest. So it's a case of when you start moving in those industries, if you're lucky enough as I was to get a kind of stamp of legitimacy and then make good on the opportunities that you're offered to demonstrate a bit of competence, you do start to feel more confident. You start to feel that the bullets that will come at you start to ricochet off you because you don't need approval to survive. You don't need them to give you an opportunity because you've become an entity in your own right and you're able to self-generate the work that you do. But not everyone's going to have that experience. And so, yeah, I can understand why some people performing that emotional labour all the time would become a bit weary,
Yeah, totally. I've seen you as well getting shit the other way too. I noticed on your social media recently you were having to bat folk off who were sort of trying to attach labels of maybe inauthenticity and saying that your accent's changed, pretentious. Yeah, exactly. And I really loved your responses to that. So will you talk a little bit about how that feels when you're getting it from both sides?
There's a group of people out there who usually it's down to a political issue that they have with you that becomes then manifest as asymmetric criticism of everything that you do. But it tends to be a group that simultaneously think that I have poshed up my accent in order to sound less working class, but who also cringe when they hear me rapping and my natural speaking style, which is Glaswegian. So I think that the issue really lies with them, and the identity crisis is something that they're having. Because I've always rejected the idea that you have to dumb it down or create the impression that you are somehow that you think intelligence is a sign of weakness, or that expressing emotions is a sign of weakness or is feminine in some way. And often, let's be honest, I mean, not to kind of generalize or stereotype, but anyone from a working class community will know that guys like that are just red flags.
Yeah.
These are the guys that are interested in violence, and these are the guys that are, can only really speak to like one or two sports in terms of what they're knowledgeable about or what they seem to care about or what they'll get out of bed for in the morning apart from work. And some of those guys, they never grow up. That's how they were as kids, and that's the attitude that they carry into adulthood.
Yeah, totally, man. I think it's really powerful seeing you kind of fight those fights publicly as well, because I think it does give younger people in a similar position permission, that it's all right to be who they want to be, to be authentic.
I love Kevin Golday's work on this.
Yeah.
I went to see his Fringe show a couple of years back. I think it was the first Fringe after lockdown. And he did a show that was, it was all draped in the iconography of the scheme, and kind of Springburn, Postle area of Glasgow. But it was him talking about his frustrations with not fitting that typical mould that media looks for, where you've got to be kind of rough or edgy, or have a background that's violence or addiction in order to be interesting culturally beyond your own social cultural sphere. And I found that show of his and that work, the piece of work that he did, kind of validating and challenging in equal measure. Because while some people would probably lump us both together in terms of what element of a working class community we arise from, because we're both creative and we both come from a scheme, I would say that we are actually quite different as well. And so there were aspects of what he was doing that even I felt challenged by. Perhaps maybe at times I've felt pressure to perform a role at the level of culture, aware of what the expectations are among middle class commissioners or middle class readers and audiences. So his work's really good on that, and I mean that's a thread through a lot of his work. But the specific show that I saw, the name escapes me. I apologise, but it was a really good sermon on all of that was funny and poignant and really good.
Yeah, Kev's brilliant. I think Kev's a great example of what Victoria was speaking about actually having someone from an area telling the stories, and he does it so well. He's also single-handedly responsible. So I write in my kind of other life, if you like, and I've always written, but I went along to the Scribblers Union that Kev was running during lockdown, and I've still got pals from to this day that he had pulled together as a kind of writing community, and it is about permission, and it felt empowering. So yeah. All power to Kev. I'll maybe hit him up, try and get him on as well. Definitely.
You should. And I like he's doing a bit more kind of commentary on the arts recently, which I think is a good space for him to get into. Because he's got a lot of insight, and he holds opinions and views that maybe necessarily wouldn't be expressing in a public way. But I think in the right moments, I think sometimes a bit of that from artists is helpful, not least for other artists. It's validating sometimes when you hear someone piping up a wee bit about something. So I look forward to more of that from him as well.
Yeah, definitely. Nice one. I had a really interesting conversation last week with a pal of mine called Gus Sproul, who's I used to be a firefighter, and I was in the fire service with Gus. He's now a full-time trade unionist. We spoke about loads of things on the podcast, but one of the big things that I'd never really thought about before was trade unionism used to be, and still is in some sectors, a real source of education for the working people who are going in there, and they'll run courses, they'll run classes in schools, and actually they do a really good job of empowering people within certain spheres. Trade unionism across the board is much less prevalent than it used to be. Certainly I grew up in the 80s, 90s, and I remember my old man speaking about, that guy's a good trade unionist, or this guy, and it just felt like it was more present, and it's not now. And it's obviously there's different ways of educating, different ways of sharing information now. But one thing that struck me was I see people like yourself who are social commentators, people who are producing amazing stage plays, books, even on their social media, as kind of plugging that gap and educating people who are interested in reading more. I'd love to know whether you see your writing as sort of collective education, similar to that once provided by the unions. Start there actually. Do you see that as
certainly, I think. Well, first of all, if you track the rise of collective bargaining and trade unions in particular in the UK, what you'll find is a kind of parallel rise in overall equality, higher levels of educational attainment, life expectancy. A kind of a small, slight leveling of the playing field, and as the trade unions were ripped out of society, then we see a flatlining or reversal of a lot of those gains. Of course, collective bargaining can have its problems, not least for the trade unionists themselves. It can be a tough, arduous, diligently democratic process, but at the same time, utterly necessary, not just because of the way that it levels negotiation for workers, but how any gains they get reverberate around communities, because where there's better pay, where there's better conditions, there's more economic activity, there's more opportunity, there's more stability at the level of family and community. So dead important. But yes, I do see myself, and what kind of criticism that I sometimes get from the left has been, that I'm portrayed in media as someone of the left or a socialist, but I've never been active in a trade union or a kind of left-wing institution. But that's a reflection of the absence of those institutions when I was coming of age. So culturally, what I fell into was carrying that same socialist activist spirit, but into the arts, into culture. And, I've done my bit, particularly in Scotland, to try and reintroduce the language of class analysis into our common lexicon, when for so long it was terms like poverty of aspiration and social mobility and working people, politicians and civic society and civil service will say anything but class, any word but class. And my presence in culture in Scotland really challenge everyone to be aware of the language that they use, because the minute that you eradicate that language from how we speak in our analysis, then you see what happens. It means it becomes easier for the snake oil salesman to blame this, that, and the next thing for the problems, because we don't have the tools to analyse materially the situation that we're in. And while I've never been involved actively in a union, I have collaborated with many different kinds of campaigns over the years, and many people get in touch with me because they recognise that I can bring a level of kind of cultural air support to what they're doing, whether it's doing a speech at a public rally, whether it's shouting something out on social media, all those little things. So yes, I think in the absence sometimes of formal structures, culturally it's easier to start pulling things together. And if my work's been about anything from day dot, it's about social inequality and class. I mean, I don't know, you'd struggle to find someone in the arts in Scotland who has been as consistent, no matter how visible they've got, about talking about those issues, and that will continue.
Yeah, nice one, Dan. I think as well, the type of work you do, that kind of in-depth, detailed, incredibly well-researched work, is a really good antidote to that kind of virtue signalling that I think some people do, where they will kind of wear the hat of being politically illiterate and aware. Actually, it's a lifestyle choice. There's no real structure to it. It's about likes. It's about posting on social media. So yeah, hats off to you, man. I think that kind of ability to challenge people with real facts is huge. And yeah, you can see you as a real ally of trade unions and of that whole movement to kind of empower and engage. So yeah, nice one, man. Yeah, moving on to a bit about personal agency and sort of stereotypes that revolve around, and moving on to the work that I know you're kind of touring at the moment. So to some people, you've taken a stance that's a bit controversial, and arguing that while obviously the system and the kind of powers that be, the system is rigged, and individuals must be able to fully operate the machinery of their own lives first. But people waiting for the system to change, it's a death sentence, isn't it, for lots of people? I spoke with Victoria. We talked about actively avoiding that kind of broken Scottish male stereotype, which I think a lot of people go to. A lot of people just default to that. I think pathologising working class men's both insulting, it's damaging, and I think it's a bit dangerous in all honesty. I'd love to know your thoughts on how we strike a balance between advocating for self-reliance without accidentally providing political cover for the state to remove essential services.
Well, I mean, first of all, the state doesn't need political cover to remove services. It will do that anyway if there's a capitalist economic imperative to do it. So my argument doesn't really come from an ideological place, and I think this is why some people on the left struggle with it, because there's no frame of reference for it. So therefore I get put into the Thatcherite, neoliberal, individuated lifestyle self-help bucket. But I think sometimes that criticism for me, it reveals that it reveals that a lot of people on the left, thinkers on the left, haven't really been active in communities. I mean, they're active in a community in the sense of they're active in a community of theorists who role play as philosophers on social media. But I've been active in a recovery community for over 10 years. Mutual aid, 12-step fellowships that have a structure from individual to group level to national, regional level to global level. This is one of the most organised movements in the world, and it's been going for nearly 100 years. And the reason it works is because we recognise that when we step in the door there, the first thing we have to do is address why we as individuals keep returning to alcohol and drugs. And what I see is people come in every year, no matter what extreme social, economic circumstances they face, no matter what their level of trauma, mental health problems, some of them, they come in and just by virtue of getting connected to a community and seeing some strong examples of how another way of life might be lived, they get better and they become useful in their community. And they might not become useful in the way that a political radical might think that you have to become useful, but there's more than one way to skin a cat, mate, and there's more than one way to change the world. And for some of us, it's you go in, you stick the kettle on, you put some seats out for somebody, and you listen to someone while they're broken. I think that is radical. And I think that sometimes in this social media climate, then people who, quite frankly, are not well enough to be getting active in politics, not mentally well enough, not physically well enough, not emotionally well enough. Sometimes they can become malleable to political manipulation and suggestions from activists who really just want to get as many people as a battering ram as possible to push forward their agenda, whatever that agenda might be. And yes, that is the calculus of an activist, and that is the calculus of a campaigner, and they have every right to do that. But what, particularly in the trauma space, I'm seeing a lot of people getting radicalised to go and, get on the front line and campaigning, and they're just too traumatised. Don't get me wrong. If you're in the middle of a genocide, or you're in a theocratic patriarchal dictatorship, you don't have the luxury of saying, no, I need some me time to sort my shit out before I go and fight the good fight. But we don't live in that scenario. We live in a Western advanced economy, a democracy that, for all its flaws, we're some of the freest people in the world. The poorest people in our country are wealthier than most people globally. And so that's not a dismissal of the idea that, there is a lot of self-helpy, just avoid politics stuff out there. I come from pure practicality, right? You've got a branch of left-wing thought that is the fix it in post campaigners. It's like, we'll have the revolution first and then we'll sort all this other stuff out. But to be honest, a lot of them, let's be honest, they aren't really doing anything. It's about identity for them too. It's about movement for them too. It's about connection for them too. Because while we might all have grand theories about how the world all fits together into our particular ideological straitjacket, a lot of what's happening in the world's out of our hands. We can see this as events are unfolded economically, militarily, environmentally. A lot of it's out of our hands. And there's no shame sometimes in saying, okay, some of this is out of my hands. What can I do? What you can do sometimes is right on your own doorstep. And that's not a failure to participate. That's actually directing your participation to something that's more tangible, where you'll see results and not be demoralised every 6 months because the world isn't going to behave the way that you want it to behave.
Totally. Recovery is a really great example of something where there's a route that people can take and kind of access support nearby and locally. I work in the charity sector. I work with people that have a visual impairment, and I used to work in mental health. And what I found was that, absolutely, people need to take responsibility, but sometimes it just feels like there's no avenue for them to access services, and it becomes a bit of a class issue. So mental health is a great example of where people are like, yep, I'll take responsibility because there's a 6-year waiting list, for a referral in the NHS. But then it comes into, can you afford to pay for something privately? And it's so challenging to get that right. So how do you strike? How do you kind of make sense of that balance in your head when it feels like there is nothing that someone can do, or nothing, no services?
There's always something someone can do. I mean, that in itself, and forgive me, that is a message that is it's not helpful in some contexts, because what it encourages is a level of dependence. So in a sense, it's the same old capitalist idea that, your value is derived from something that's outside of yourself. So go and consume things, go and find things, go and access things, go and acquire things, and then you will be full, then you will be capable, then you will be enough. As I say, the 12-step model is one that a lot of people should look into and study, because really it's just a bunch of people with no qualifications, no money, operating on a voluntary basis because it helps to keep them well, to behave in an altruistic manner no matter how desolate and despairing the circumstances are. And people come in there with grave emotional and physical and economic problems, and they get better. And if our message was, the door's not open because we never made enough money last week, then people would die. Do you know what I mean? So, we make it work. Now, I realise you can't scale that up and apply that to the third sector, and there's a society that's all layered on top of decades and decades of different things, and it's very, very complicated. But my call to personal agency comes in that context of realising how hard it is for people to access certain things, or the hoops that they have to jump through. So it's saying, look, if you feel like it's a last chance saloon and you've been told you need to wait 8 months to see a mental health professional, think about it like this. If you were by the roadside and you'd been in a car accident and your leg was broken and you knew that an ambulance was coming, you would stay there. But if you knew an ambulance wasn't coming, a storm was coming and it was getting dark, you would fucking figure out a way to move if you could.
Crawl, yeah.
And that's the situation that people are in. And that's the framing that's necessary when you're navigating this particular argument that you've put to me.
Yeah.
You know, some people, their life is in the balance, action is required. It's not all down to them, but there are people out there in their community, if they go looking, who will help them, and that help will be significant.
Yeah, you bang on. I was just about to say the words that were springing to my head is peer support. There's always peer support out there, even if there's not official services. So, yeah, thank you for that, Darren. I appreciate it. And you mentioned the 12 Steps program there. Right when I first started this, I spoke to an amazing guest on the podcast, so Kirsty Mulcahy, who started an organisation called Sober Buzz. I don't know if you've met Kirsty before, but she's
Follow her
great.
on Instagram, yep.
Yeah, honestly, she does amazing things, and I think has genuinely saved people. So shout out to Kirsty. So I stopped drinking a few years back. I've had issues with alcohol addiction in my family. Felt like quite a radical thing to do as a Scottish male to stop drinking. It's amazing the response it gets
It
from
used
some
to
people.
be a pretty radical thing to do. It used to be really part of a political mindset to keep yourself fucking sober and recognise how alcohol was being used to dumb you down and your class down. But I mean, that's all gone out the fucking window now. Do you know, it's weird. Totally. It's weird to get sober now for some reason.
Yeah, exactly. It's a massive head fuck to other people more than it is to the likes of myself. So, but yeah, Kirsty was amazing. But she spoke about an empowered sobriety, but stepping away from traditional recovery structures like 12 steps, because that didn't quite work for her, although, as you've pointed out, it does for tons of people. One thing I've become aware of is that social media, obviously the algorithm cottons onto things, is flooded with people's recovery stories, people's trauma stories. Interested whether you think that excess of stories can make it harder for some people to move on or to cement their own situation. What are your thoughts on that?
Personal stories and authenticity is a real premium in a culture full of distraction and an abundance of content. One thing that will stop you in your tracks is a real person saying in a very earnest way, I went through this terrible thing. That's natural. What's not natural is the kind of capitalist imperatives that underscore big tech companies, algorithms, and ultimately we are now in an era where people at great risk to themselves and the people close to them will be disclosing very intimate details of traumatic events that occurred in their lives before they've really had a chance to work on the wounds and to make sufficient meaning of their experiences so as to properly call it anything other than cathartic. People have this method of recovering from trauma or adversity being modelled to them on social media, which is just get in a confessional headspace, point a camera in your face, make some content, and this will get you out of the rut that you're in. And while for some people maybe that works and leads to opportunities, the truth is for other people it will not give them the kind of sense of safety and security that maybe they're seeking in this behaviour. And so my recent work over the last couple of years has been a bit of a pivot from talking about social inequality, because I believe this is also an urgent issue, that you have the rise of the lived experience commentator, the lived experience personality, and we see it in all forms of media. We see it in Netflix dramas, we see it in reality television, we see it in journalism, we see it in news media, podcasts. And it's interesting because people, when it comes to other products like food and clothing, they can be very particular about the ethics of how this stuff is produced. But no one thinks twice when they turn on a Vice video on social media that's got 1 million views and it's just, an 18-year-old girl talking about how she's been sexually abused. And in such a gratuitous way that's not really about anything other than homing in on the details, because it's catnip to the average person and the average algorithm. For me, that sort of stuff's irresponsible. Now, I can't take away the agency of people who decide to do these things, so I come at it from an angle of, if you do want to talk about your experiences, here are some things you might consider before doing so. The first one is everything you're talking about absolutely true? Is it absolutely true? Because if it's not and you go public, somebody's going to doubt your story and that's going to be painful. There are ways that we think about our lives and experiences that feel true to us, but might not be exactly true in the way that we think. And so that's the first risk. The next thing is, why are we doing it? What do we want? And it's okay to want anything. You can want validation, you can want visibility, you can want opportunities, you can want to feel like you're helping people. But if you're not clear about why you're doing it, then when the rewards come, you won't know how to internalize them or even identify them because you've behaved impulsively. So what is it that you want by telling your story? And then the other thing about it is just that as you grow and mature and recover from different things, aspects of your story will change, and you might look back with a sense of regret about the version or the draft that you released publicly. And without proper guidance and support, you might struggle with an ego that wants you to retain, for continuity purposes, the version that was out there before, with the deep truth that you know inside that sometimes it's never as simple as victims and perpetrators. Sometimes the trauma that we like to signal that we suffer from can manifest as harm for other people in our lives. And most people aren't comfortable telling that side of the story of trauma. They want to tell the side of the story of trauma about what happened to them and how it hurt, not how they're dysregulated around their own children, how they shut other people's emotions down because they can't cope with other people having big feelings, how they isolate, how they're not really there for other people in their life. Sometimes it can manifest kind of paradoxically as a sort of self-centeredness because we've been living in this victim mindset for so long. We don't experience accountability in the same way because other people are kind of wrapping us in cotton wool. And so you can become tyrannical in your own life or believing you're the only person who's suffering. These are all the risks that you run if you put visibility before actual healing. Because just surviving a thing's not the same as recovering from it, but you wouldn't know that from a lot of the content that you see on social media.
I think that's key, isn't it? Yeah, just surviving is definitely not the same as recovering. And also I think for some people, once they've put it out there as their identity, it's very difficult to claw that back, because once something's out in the world, that's it, and that's what people are seeing, and that's the label you've got, which is tough. How talk to me a little bit about the Trauma Industrial Complex tour that you've got going on. What's the kind of structure? What's the setup? What can people expect at that?
We have a 1 hour presentation, I'm calling it, and I don't like to give too much away.
Of course,
but it's very much set up like a book reading, but it evolves as the performance goes on. Much like trauma, it starts to take you in directions that you're not expecting. Some of them are challenging, some of them are emotional, and some of them are illuminating. And the performance presentation aspect kind of mirrors the 3-act structure of a story, which is also the structure that most publicly disclosed traumas conform to. And that in itself is a problematic way of looking at trauma, because trauma, unlike a story, is not linear. It doesn't proceed from Act 1 to Act 2 to Act 3. And so because I'm using that kind of classic hero's journey structure, then I get to play in quite a kind of metatextual way with the healing process in trauma, and showing how it's not as simple and can't be fit into a little narrative arc, and that sometimes we oversimplify it and might actually start to believe ourselves thinking in movie form and story form and missing the parts of our journey that we're skipping over. And then the second part of the show is just a Q&A. It gives the audience a chance in a group setting to kind of decompress. There are heavy themes in the first part of the show, the first hour, that the audiences are challenged by. And so you need that resolution. You need that decompression at the end, that re-establishing safety, as a preeminent trauma theorist would call it. Judith Herman, she would call it establishing safety. That's the first step. You know what I mean? And I'm 3 shows in, and I've got my 2 biggest shows coming up over the next 2 weeks. I've got Aberdeen at the Tivoli, and then I've got Beacon and Greenock. And I'm looking forward to being in those bigger venues with a bigger audience to see how it carries over at that scale. Because so far I've done more intimate performances at 100 to 150, which is still big for most artists. It's still a big audience. But I'm enjoying it. And audiences are reporting just a sense of surprise at the way that the show moves them and the way that the show plays with them. Because every reaction the audience has in the show, unbeknownst to them, is one that I'm creating so that I can analyse it as we go. And I think that the audience become part of the show in that regard. I know that might sound sort of scary to some people, but I'm told it's actually been quite cathartic for a lot of people, and that's good, because that was the hope. Yeah,
but just on, as someone who's very vocal and very educated and very open about the work you've done around trauma, do you find people opening up to you in a way? Like, do you have to be aware to people actually disclosing things, people potentially opening the door on stuff that's troubling for them?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had that I've always had that, just because my music's always been quite personal, and I think maybe the persona that I project out there is someone who's quite open and approachable, which I am generally. But yeah, sometimes it can verge on inappropriate, or sometimes you need to establish a boundary with some people. You can have people disclosing, um, quite horrendous details of experiences that they've gone through, and maybe a moment of inebriation or impulsivity, and that can be in person or online. And then you can have people kind of flip on you, and you become sort of a villain in their story.
Oh, wow.
Because of some aspect of something that you've said, or if you've had a personal relationship with a person previously, in a relationship that's sort of fallen apart or whatever. It's like this person no longer sees you as a human being. They see you through the entity, your cultural entity, your persona that you project. Um, but over the years, I've got better at recognizing how to respond to different things. Sometimes the response is just you've got to block and move on. Sometimes it's I don't know if I'm the person to be coming to with this information. And then sometimes, let's be frank, you've got to say, look, if you don't fucking stop this shit, do you know what I mean? I'll be coming to see you. Do you know what I mean? Because you can't use your trauma as an excuse to threaten me, or you can't use your trauma as an excuse to criticise, this, that, and the next thing, and be a prick, basically. So it's just take everything as it comes. But this is part of the challenge for anyone out there who wants to become a public person who's associated with a particular type of adversity. You're going to be seen as a go-to person for journalists, for commentators, and for regular people. And depending on what your level of visibility is, then that correspondence and those demands will increase or decrease. And whatever value you attach to that, whatever esteem you derive from it being up and down, then you're going to be on a roller coaster. And I've seen many, many lived experience personalities who enjoy this certain level of fame and prominence, and really being seen as the go-to person on certain issues. And then they relapse, and then everyone runs for cover, and then suddenly that person's in a personality spiral and a self-esteem spiral, because they thought all these people were their friends. They didn't realise they're operating in a transactional culture, and they weren't resilient enough to withstand what happens when the withdrawal occurs. Luckily, I understand that, and I'll be just fine.
Yeah, exactly. It takes a full circle back to what you said before about the importance of actually having done the work and recovered rather than just survived before you go public and do it. But do you know what? It was interesting. It made me really stop and think when I was prepping for this, because obviously, creative resistance, I speak to people who are tackling big topics of the day, and it really made me aware and ask myself the question, am I actually trying to commodify the shit that other people are going through, and making sure that I pedal back and don't actually give people the space to listen. So, yeah, it's been a huge privilege to chat to you, Darren, and get your thoughts on all this stuff, man. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to try and get down to see the show. I think you're in Gala Shields at some point. I can't remember the date. I took a note
Yeah,
before.
Mac Arts. I can't remember either. I think it might be May.
Yeah. What I'll do is I'll stick links to the upcoming shows and the rest of the tour in the show notes as well, and obviously share on social media. But yeah, just huge thank you. Really do appreciate it. What's the best place for people to follow what you're doing? Find out where you're
I'm
at?
quite active on Instagram just now after deleting my ex account, so I'm trying to kind of grow my audience there, and it's going really well. And that's obviously where most people will be able to hear about what I'm up to and get links to various things. So just Darren_McGarvey on Instagram. You see a picture of my coupon, and that's the Darren McGarvey to follow. Apart from that, then hopefully the word's getting out, even if people aren't actively following me. That's what you're hoping for when you're on tour, that it starts to become its own thing and the word starts to generate. So I think we're getting to that tipping point now, thankfully, after a slow start. So this really helps, and it's been lovely to speak to you too, Scott.
Oh, nice one, Darren. All the best, mate. Cheers.